For decades now, mass indiscriminate immigration has been tearing at the fabric of Australian society. It is exacerbating crises in housing, infrastructure, health, policing and welfare. Even more importantly, our diplomacy, sovereignty and strategic defence capabilities are at increasing risk due to growing voting blocs with degrees of loyalty to other nations, some of which are dangerous strategic rivals. Recent immigrants have conducted multiple deadly terror attacks on Australian soil, which have had devastating effects on those targeted. ASIO Chief Mike Burgess is concerned that more could be on the way. To make matters worse, hard-won freedoms are being curtailed at an alarming rate in order to dampen resistance to this influx of diverse migrants. But most sobering of all, the Australian nation itself is under threat. Our children and grandchildren are facing the prospect of becoming a hated, persecuted minority, a stateless people abandoned by the Commonwealth that was created by their ancestors. To understand why immigration is having such a detrimental impact on the well-being of the nation, it's important to understand what is actually meant by the term nation. When most people think of a nation, they envision an arbitrary line on a map called a border and assume that everything inside those boundaries constitutes the nation. Whilst this is partly correct, the scientific and sociological definition of a nation is an ethnic group living in its own homeland. The idea of an ethnic group can be a little fuzzy around the edges, but what really tends to bind humans together in groups is a sense of shared heritage. This can be seen most clearly in family settings, where parents will sacrifice almost anything to ensure the well-being of their children. Doing so makes sense in evolutionary terms, as our children have a large parcel of our genetic makeup, which will carry a part of ourselves into the evolutionary future. When humans build groups larger than extended families, we tend to feel more affinity for people who share language, culture, race, religion, and that previously mentioned sense of shared heritage. Over time, as farming and technology advanced, some groups expanded into tribes and eventually into nation-states. This was not an easy transition, and it didn't happen simultaneously around the world. Creating a shared loyalty to a new entity such as a nation-state is difficult and takes considerable time and effort. England was one of the first nations to successfully complete this transition, aided by its island geography. Over the centuries, the emerging British nation, a union of similar peoples with a core Anglo identity and crown, created the largest empire the world had ever seen. Whatever your thoughts on the pros or cons of the British Empire, its rise demonstrates the incredible power of a cohesive nation-state which is relatively culturally and ethnically homogenous. It was this power that enabled the British nation to subdue much larger areas, populated with squabbling and divided tribal groups. Another great strength of the British was their system of government, which developed as a monarchy with a constitutional parliamentary democracy. In the early days, the voting franchise was limited mostly to men with a degree of wealth. Over time, however, the franchise widened considerably until every adult could vote. This had some great advantages, particularly for the less well-off. Unfortunately, it also had some serious disadvantages which tend to be overlooked. One of these faults is potentially catastrophic for the nation, yet seems to have gone almost entirely unnoticed, at least within the Western democracies themselves. A democracy can only function well if it has a high degree of homogeneity and the citizens have a sense of shared identity and responsibility. In this case, voters will have an incentive to vote for things which benefit the entire society, even if it is not an immediate benefit to themselves. In countries which are split ethnically, culturally, religiously or tribally, democracy tends to be dysfunctional. In these types of societies, people tend to vote along group or tribal lines and are often happy to tolerate the worst forms of corruption from their leaders, providing they're being cut in on the grift. A particularly stark example happened in Detroit in the USA. In the 1950s, Detroit was probably the richest city in the USA, if not the entire world. At the time, it was largely white, but had a substantial minority of African Americans who had moved there from the South, which was poorer and had higher levels of racial discrimination. In 1961, the mayor of Detroit, Louis Miriani, lost his re-election bid because he was known to be corrupt. This was later borne out when he went to prison for tax evasion. His replacement, Jerome Kavanaugh, won the election promising to give Detroit's African-American population civil rights. Having seen the success of this strategy, he began pandering to the interests of this community and funneling money from the wealthier whites in suburban areas to the poorer inner-city blacks. Kavanaugh was soon replaced by black politicians promising exactly the same thing on a larger scale. An example was John Conyers Jr., an African-American who secured a seat in the House of Representatives for the Democrat Party in Detroit. Conyers received 84% of the vote in 1964 and was re-elected 13 times, often with an even larger margin. This despite the fact that Detroit during that time was going from the richest city in America to one of the poorest, most dangerous and mismanaged cities in the USA. At the same time, Conyers was embroiled in numerous scandals, which included an affidavit by a former employee that he paid her off over an incident of sexual harassment with $27,000 in public money. Meanwhile, his wife, who was on the city council, actually went to jail after pleading guilty to bribery charges. Unlike his white predecessor, however, Conyers never lost an election, despite years of corruption and gross mismanagement. His lowest vote count was 77%. Today, you would be hard-pressed to find any white people in positions of power in Detroit. Due to changing demography and ethnic bloc voting, political power has been transferred mostly to African American and other minority groups. These groups now make up the majority of the city's population, thanks to the disastrous impact of tribal voting patterns in a modern democracy. The white population mostly fled after losing political influence and then being targeted for wealth transfers by governments and crime gangs. Detroit is now utterly dysfunctional and racked by poverty and crime. Here in Australia, one of the most poignant examples of minority voting power came with the defeat of John Howard in 2007. Not only did his political party lose the election, but Howard, who was one of Australia's longest-serving prime ministers, lost his seat. Howard's success had been built on a hard line against illegal immigration. This position brought favour from working-class voters who felt abandoned on the issue by the Labour Party. Unknown to most of these voters, however, Howard had quietly ramped up Asian immigration by a huge margin. His own affluent constituency had attracted a substantial number of the more wealthy Chinese and South Korean migrants. The anti-immigration sentiment at the time was a reaction to the mass indiscriminate immigration of the previous few decades and led to the formation of a minor political party called One Nation. John Howard had been less openly hostile to One Nation than his opponents would have preferred, probably due to a desire to placate his new working-class voting base. Despite this, he had little to no sympathy for the group interests of the white majority, declaring that Australia was not multicultural, but multiracial. He agreed with earlier Prime Ministers Malcolm Fraser and Bob Hawke that Australia should have no national identity based on ethnicity. Everyone should simply be Australian with no other affiliation. Unfortunately for John Howard, the Chinese and Koreans he had imported didn't subscribe to this white Western fantasy. In the 2007 election, the Labour Party targeted these new arrivals in John Howard's electorate with a campaign to vote against him because of his delayed opposition to One Nation, the only party which had openly opposed mass Asian immigration. The result was a stunning electoral upset in a formerly safe Liberal electorate, and Prime Minister Howard lost his seat. The message was loud and clear to any politicians who want to retain their positions and their privileges. The reality, which Western politicians understand, is that Anglo-Celtic and other white Australians are inclined to vote according to who they think can do the best for the country as a whole. White votes therefore tend to split fairly evenly amongst the two main parties and are generally taken for granted by politicians. This is changing slowly. Brexit and the election of Donald Trump were clear examples of a growing trend among whites who are tired of politicians who actively attack their group interests. Whilst Trump was never explicitly pro-white, he wasn't hostile to traditional Americans and refused to endorse policies which were harmful to them, such as allowing large-scale illegal immigration from Mexico. Unfortunately, decades of sophisticated propaganda have conditioned many whites to despise politicians who are not hostile to their group interests, believing them to be actual Nazis or literally Hitler. Minorities, meanwhile, are inclined to vote for those who will serve their group interests best, particularly in the area of immigration of their own people.
It's always good to have people representing our race here.
I think it's good for Australia because Australia is famous for its diversity.
Some people from similar background as me are going to come to the parliament. It's going to always be a good thing.
They're certainly not hostile to politicians who promote their group interests. Why would they be? This leads to a bidding war between the political parties for the votes of minorities who can swing elections one way or another. What minority groups want most, of course, is more immigration of their group, because more migrants means more political power for them. Indians, Chinese and Muslims in particular have huge pools of potential friendly migrants back home. Any one of these groups could swamp Australia and vote traditional Australians out of their nation if the government allows it. This presents the Australian nation with an existential threat. Our ancestors created the Federal Commonwealth to protect our national interests, primarily against invasion. That great protective institution has been hijacked and turned against us. We're being colonised at the behest of our own political class. If this situation continues, our descendants will be subject to the culture and interests of the largest pools of immigrants. These cultures are alien and sometimes hostile to us and our Western individualist values. Politicians want to grab and hold on to power, so they lie to you. They tell you that indiscriminate immigration is enriching your society. They say it makes us better off, that migrants do jobs that we don't want to do, that we must populate or perish, and blah, blah, blah. If you don't buy into all of this, then they attack your character. They call you a mean-spirited, racist, Nazi monster who doesn't care about poor refugees and blah, blah, blah. Never forget that these politicians are the ones who are selling out their people for a chance to keep their own grubby noses in the public trough. In the face of this onslaught, the bravest of Conservatives lament the use of identity politics by our enemies and implore them to stop using this highly effective strategy. The reality is that this is never going to happen. Instead, like it or not, our only chance of success is to embrace the tactics of our enemies. If you can't beat them, join them. This requires an organisation whose mission is to advocate for and protect the interests of the Anglo-Celtic majority. The organisation must not be radical or extreme, but measured, thoughtful and humane in its outlook. It must be honourable, honest and have high standards of integrity and governance. It should have proven analytical and strategic abilities. But above all, it must be clear in its mission to legitimise the promotion of the group interests of British and European-descended Australians, without meaning harm or malice to other citizens. The British Australian community is such an organisation. We have positioned ourselves as part of the multicultural community. That means that in order to attack our modus operandi, one would have to attack the basis of multiculturalism itself. We are well equipped to take on this fight and win it, but we can't do it alone. We need our people to awaken and join us. Membership is just $25 a year, and we need quality people to help out with time and effort. That path is a path to victory, but it depends on people like you to do something. You can start by liking and sharing this video, by buying our books, watching our other videos, and by joining and getting involved. Doing nothing is a pathway to an Australia that looks something like Detroit. Your choice.
This video has been proudly produced by the British Australian community.